story starts with the government of Rome just wanting its money and having people go to their towns, go to your town, so we can collect your taxes. We can register you and make sure we get our taxes from you. So imagine, first century, the Romans are forcing you to go to your hometown to register so they can collect taxes from you. But is the book of Luke reliable? So Luke records this, but is that book reliable? Skeptics argue that the census was after Jesus' birth in 7 AD. Why did they do this? If you look on the internet, you'll find people saying, oh, this is inaccurate. The census occurred in 7 AD after Jesus' birth. But because a Jewish historian named Josephus reports that Quirinius was governor of Syria and took a census then, that's why they doubt this. Let's have a look at this. How does Josephus stack up to Luke, by the way? Well, the time between the writing of the manuscript and the writing of the document and the earliest manuscript that we have surviving, look at Josephus, 900 years. Josephus actually lived in 70 or so AD and later, and he wrote about things that he didn't really see, but he wrote about history. And he wrote the entire history of the Jews, about 1,000 pages. But the earliest manuscript copy we have is is about 1000 AD, and we only have a few surviving manuscripts. For Luke, there are copies of Luke within 100 to 160 years of his writing. He probably wrote 60, 70 AD, and we have copies of his writings within 100 years. So if you're going to trust one of them, which one are you going to trust? The one that you have to wait 1,000 years to find actually a copy, or the one that you have actual copies clear to the time of the writing? And thousands of surviving manuscripts. So if you're going to trust one of these, which one are you going to trust? I'm going to go with Luke. Not only that, but Josephus doesn't actually exclude the possibility that Quirinius was governor earlier. He doesn't say, oh, he was only governor this time and no other time. Josephus leaves open the possibility there could have been an earlier census. He simply doesn't record an earlier census. So Josephus actually is probably not as complete as Luke. Luke's more interested in exactly what is happening than Josephus is. Here's a manuscript, early manuscript, the Papyrus Bodmer, number 75, and it's dated about 175 to 225 AD. So that is a copy of the book of Luke that is within about 150 years of his writing it. And by the way, it's found in Pabao, Egypt. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, found in the 1950s. So this is a copy of it, and it's already translated in a different language, and it's on another continent. It was written far earlier. Now this is why the great archaeologist William Ramsay of Oxford and Cambridge University argued that Quirinius ruled twice in Syria. This was partly based on the Latin Tiburtine inscription discovered in 1746, which referred to someone ruling Syria twice. And Ramsay argued that Quirinius fitted that description. And Luke refers, by the way, Luke himself refers to a second census in Acts 5:37, years later than Jesus' birth. So he's clearly, Luke's not confused. He wrote the book of Luke, and then he wrote a follow-on continuing the history of the early church, the book of Acts, and he's recording a second census. Here's Luke. He was a physician that traveled around with Paul on his missionary journeys. All the evidence supports this. And he would have interviewed, he would have known not only the eyewitnesses, but he knew the disciples. He spent lots of time with them. He would have known Mary and talked to her. He would have known all of these details. And he knows the brother of Jesus, James. So he would have had all this information. Unlike Josephus, who lived in Rome in 70 AD, who probably had no opportunity to actually interview eyewitnesses anyway. So here's what Luke says, by the way, about himself. He says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have happened, things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. So he's saying, my purpose is not to write a fairy tale or a story. This is not Winnie the Pooh. What I'm doing is I'm investigating, and I'm going to write a very careful account. Here's a physician, detail-oriented, probably scientific-minded. He wants to take a careful account. So Luke and Matthew, by the way, I don't have time to go into all the evidence of the different ones, but Luke and Matthew witnessed the events themselves or actually interviewed eyewitnesses. This is powerful stuff. As if that's not enough, there's external evidence that Luke wrote his book, and he was in the circles of eyewitnesses, and that Matthew wrote Matthew, and he was also an eyewitness. Polycarp, you don't have to look at this whole chart, but Polycarp was a direct disciple of John, who was friends with all these people and in the circle of it, and he wrote and said, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, Matthew and John wrote their books. So here's a guy living 70 to 156 AD who actually knew John and was a disciple of John and got this information direct. Oh, these guys really did write these books. As if that isn't enough, Clement of Rome is a disciple, direct disciple of the apostles, and he quotes from Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, etc. So there's more information than that. But for no other document of the entire ancient world is there external validation of authorship. Josephus has a couple of copies of his writing 1,000 years later, but there's nobody that says, oh, yeah, Josephus really the Jewish guy in Rome. He wrote that book. There's no evidence externally for any other document. So if you're going to throw out Luke, throw out Matthew's accounts, you'd have to throw out your entire knowledge of the classical world. So archaeology, by the way, supports Luke. So William Ramsay set out. He was in the he studied in universities that were really skeptical at the turn of the century, and he believed all this stuff. Luke's really not really very accurate, but he loved archaeology, so he spent his time in what was then Turkey, and he did for decades. He did archaeological work. Whenever they were digging up building a new house, and a stone turned up with an inscription on it, he would be over there researching it. So he did this for decades, and he found out, he decided, wow, he was amazed that what he found supported Luke, and actually refuted all the critics. He actually knew more than they knew. They just didn't realize it. And so he went out to write a book, and he said, he concluded that Luke's history is unsurpassed in its trustworthiness. This is his work in 1915. So he's sort of the Indiana Jones, really the Indiana Jones of the turn of the century. So as if this isn't enough, there's a power of cross-examination, knowing these things are accurate. Because hostile parties, with the means and the motive and the opportunity to refute something that's being said. In other words, they really have a motive. They really want to refute it. They don't like what's being said. They don't like the conclusions. And they also have a means. They have a platform. They have a place. They can actually talk about it. And they have the opportunity offer a check to something that's being said for its truthfulness. So who had those means, motive, and opportunity? The Jews and the Romans. Now the Jews didn't, in case you hadn't noticed, the Jewish religious leaders, they didn't like Jesus. They had him crucified. They wanted to shut him up. And the disciples afterwards, when they were talking about Jesus, they whipped him and beat him and said, don't talk about him anymore. So they wanted to shut this thing down. And they had the power. They were running the temple. They could have certainly said, oh, no, Jesus really wasn't born in Bethlehem. We got the record right here. He was born in Nazareth. Oh, by the way, that prophecy about him being born of a virgin, that's not really a virgin. That's about a maiden. Oh, you know what? There really wasn't a star. Oh, no, those magi, they really didn't come here. Luke is making all this up. Oh, by the way, no, Herod didn't really ask us, where he would be born, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They could have refuted Luke right off the bat. But guess what? They didn't. And then the Romans didn't like this commotion going on. They were throwing Christians into the arena to be torn apart by lions. They didn't want this stuff going on. They wanted to shut this thing down too. So if they could have, they certainly would have. They would have said, you got the census wrong, buddy. They would have shut it down right away, but they didn't. And the Jews were commenting on the scriptures and commenting on things that were going on all the time. That's what the Talmud is. So So they had every opportunity to do this, but they didn't. Why? Because they couldn't. So these guys are very good eyewitnesses. So now what we're going to go into is, what about the scriptures? What do they say? What about Luke and what about Matthew? What do they say? Well, there's 7 specifiers that will specify one unique person. If you wanted to mail a letter and have it get to me, out of 7 billion people on the planet, you would only need 7 pieces of information. And that letter would go to no one else but me. You need the country, USA. I'm not going to put my address up here, I'm a John Doe, but anyway, you get the point. The state is New York, the town Del Mar, let's say the street is Delaware Avenue, the house number 202, first name, or last name Smith, and the given name John. So guess who's going to get that letter? John Smith. Nobody else will get it. Just like this, you can mail a letter to anybody in the entire planet, 7 billion people. And with 7 specifiers, it will point out this is the only person to get that letter. Well, in the same way, God specified the address, so to speak, of the Messiah. So nobody would miss him. Nobody would say, oh, he's over here. Oh, is this it? Is this? No. He specified it specifically and accurately so nobody would miss him. How did he do that? That's what we're going to talk about. Malachi 3:1 says the Messiah, I'm going to go through the prophecies that are in the Old Testament, the writings that were already in existence that the Jews all knew about, that were talking about the Messiah, and specifically exactly what would happen when the Messiah comes. Well, first of all, the Messiah would have to enter the temple. It says in Malachi 3:1, which was written